I went out the other day with my 4x5 camera, the Intrepid, to a place I've been to a number of times before, and you may have seen videos from there. It's an old moorings where there are some decrepit boats and interesting mud patterns. Now, what was interesting on this particular visit is I decided to develop the films with different chemicals at the end of the trip, just to see if I could get a variation and see how it affected the likes of contrast and sharpness, etc. And I'd also like to show you the negatives in a bit more detail in Lightroom. So before that, let's have a look at the trip, go through the video, and I'll see you back here in a minute. Well, I'm back down at the moorings at Heswall, one of the locations you may have seen me shoot before, with derelict old boats such as the one behind. And they are cleaning up the area quite a lot in the recent years. Some of the boats have gone now, some of my favourite boats, so there's less and less to interest me, so I'm trying to make the most of it while it's still here, trying to capture a record of the sort of history of the place, really. But what I have noticed as well, now that it's getting close to summer, is a lot of the mud is drying up, creating interesting patterns, so it's not all just about the boats today. Well, what's not helping me at the moment is the rain. The forecast is for rain, and I've already got some, unfortunately. And using 4x5 in the rain it's not very easy. There's nothing waterproof about the camera or the lenses or the film backs, so all I can do at the moment is cover the camera up and just hope it passes. Now, one of the unfortunate things about this little rain shower is that it's wet, the mud. Now, when I arrived about half an hour ago, the mud was lovely and dry, and it had a much higher contrast with the surrounding vegetation and also the little rivulets, the gullies. Now it's become a little bit more uniform and not as photogenic, which is pretty sad really, because it looked fantastic for about 10 minutes. I think one of the things I can do to compensate for that is probably to use a slightly higher contrast film to try and boost that back a little bit. So I think I'll probably use I'll use FP4 Plus instead of HP5, just to give me a little bit more boost. Okay, pleased to say the rain has eased off a little bit. It's going to come back though, so I have to work quickly. My shot comprises a little rivulet, a little drain running out to the main channel, and it's all about the cracked mud here. Thankfully the mud has started to dry out slightly, so I have a little bit more contrast back. Now, my camera settings, I have FP4 Plus loaded in the 4x5 film holder. I'm using my standard lens, 150mm Nikkor. Absolutely no reason for a wide angle here or a telephoto. I can get the shot I need with the standard focal length, which is about 45mm. Now, one of the huge advantages to large format over just about everything else is the fact that you have camera movements. Now, this subject is planar, which means the image plane, all the interesting elements are on the same plane of focus. There's nothing sticking up, there's nothing dropping down, so I can use a little bit of front tilt on the front standard of the 4x5, which allows you to put everything in focus very easily. Now, still stop down to f22 because the lens really is happy around f22, and it will take care of any little anomalies in my focusing, any small errors. If I nudge the camera slightly and it maybe moves out of focus, so f22 is absolutely ideal. Now, I've taken two shots because I want a safety image, because what if I cock up the film processing? What if there's a scratch on the film? What if I knock the camera during exposure? Film's about sort of £1.40 a sheet for FP4 Plus, and I've shot the first one at half a second, and I've given myself a little bit more exposure on the second, just to a 1 second exposure, so an extra stop of exposure there. There's really very little dynamic range in the shot though, so there's no problem with this coming out at all. Now, I'm really pleased with that shot of the mud, and I intend to continue in the same vein because there is a stack of dried up mud around here, and that's not the only composition I saw when I was recceing the area. Just being careful where I put my feet here because there are lots of deep gullies and you'll go up to your knees or your waist if you tread in the wrong one, so take care if you come here. I've got a slightly more dramatic one behind me. Now, this one's interesting, but it's a little bit more tricky because the last one was a very simple composition. It was just the mud. Now, there are little twists and bends in here, so you have to get the right angles, but also there's vegetation. Now, that vegetation can either detract or enhance the shot depending on how you use it. So my plan is to try and line up something with a little bit of vegetation and add a little bit of interest to the scene, a little bit of a break to the unending broken mud. But I have to be very, very specific where I place those elements, and I may need a longer lens just to isolate things. Now, I've got my second shot in the bag, and apologies for not taking you through the setup as I was doing it, because the showers are just sort of fleeting past me and I have to get the images quickly, so I'm working faster than I would normally. Anyway, the setup. I have my camera set up pointing at a lovely bit of cracked mud yet again, but this time I've got the vegetation I was talking about, so I have set something against the mud. It's not just about the curves and the shape this time. I've got my longer lens on, as I explained. It's a 240mm, so it's a short telephoto. And I've had to use considerably more tilt with this lens because it's a longer focal length. You need to tilt it more to get the focal plane laid across the mud. And I've gone for f22 again. It's perfect aperture for this lens. Also very, very easy to focus, this lens, despite it being an f9, believe it or not. That's the maximum aperture of it. It's very clear. Now, to accentuate the vegetation and hopefully bring it out a little bit more against that muddy background, because it could all just blend in, I've used 2 filters. The first time I shot it with a yellow filter and I used 2 seconds. The second time I've shot it with a green filter and I've used 6 seconds. That allows for the filter factor and a bit of reciprocity failure on the film, where it actually gets slower as you get beyond a second of exposure. Can't guarantee that it's going to lift the vegetation that much. It will make a small difference, but I can do some in post-processing as well. I don't want it to stand out, I don't want it glowing like some infrared image, but I do want some difference between the mud and the vegetation. Now, I shoot with all manner of formats. I shoot digital, mainly micro four thirds. I shoot a lot of 35mm. I shoot medium format. I shoot large format, obviously, up to 10x8, 8x10. But each has their place. Each has their own strength and weakness. And this location, in particular, with the weather I've got today, which is quite calm, absolutely lends itself to large format. It is the perfect format because I have the movements, I've got the time, I've got the access to this location. It's only about 40 minutes from home. So shooting with a smaller format is good, it's flexible, and I do get different shots. I can work handheld with the 35mm. But large format here, it's absolutely made for large format, I'll be honest. It's a gift for large format photographers. And if you've got the time and the inclination to shoot this sort of material, I can highly recommend it. Okay, I've made my final exposure for the morning. I was wandering around for about an hour after the last shot, and the obvious images were the boats, and I spent an awful long time trying to get something which was different than I took last time, something which I haven't taken before. And you know, I really couldn't get it. I couldn't sort of resolve an image in my mind with the preview device, and also I found it jarred a little bit with the earlier shots, which were of the cracked mud. So I thought for the last shot I would go with the same theme as earlier, sort of make a common theme throughout the morning. And I've gone for more cracked mud shots, but this time they've got dog tracks in them. Now, I've shot this many years ago here before with dog tracks, and I actually like the way it breaks up the sort of almost symmetry of the cracks within the mud. Now, I've had to use my longer lens again to isolate the subject against the background, which is a little bit cluttered. It's got boats in there, it's got grasses which are waving about in the wind. I just want the mud and the cracks. So I've cropped in and I've used FP4+ again, plenty of front tilt, so I can actually get the subject matter planar, totally flat, very easy to focus on that way. F22, a quarter of a second and an eighth of a second, just to give me a bit of leeway. Not a problem at all. Well, that was a very, very enjoyable couple of hours shoot with a large format camera. Beautiful location, quiet, early morning, and I think I got what I was after. Again, despite the fact the boats are the obvious attraction, what's left of them anyway, I preferred the mud, and you only get that mud in the summertime really. It dries out. In the winter it's just horrible, as you may have seen on an earlier shoot. So I'm really pleased. I'm going to get these developed. I think I'll run them through ID11. I may run the second shots through something like HC110, a bit more contrast and grain, depending on the first ones come out anyway. But as ever, I do hope you've enjoyed this short ramble with me, and I'll see you again on the next one. Thanks for watching. Righto, I do hope you enjoyed the video. I really had a good time. It was only a couple of hours, but I have to say the 4x5 was absolutely perfect on the day. The ability to use the front tilt, superb. I wouldn't have enjoyed myself as much with even the small 35mm or a digital format. It was wonderful to see it through the ground glass, everything in focus. Anyway, back to the point of this. Let's have a look briefly at the negatives. This is my two sets of negatives. I've taken the first shot, which was at the measured exposure, and I've developed them in ID11. We'll look at those in a minute on the light box. And the second shots, the safety shots, which were typically +1 exposure, I developed them in Kodak HC110, HC110, dilution I think B, anyway it's 1:31, quite a standard dilution. I can't see any difference when I've put them into Lightroom and scanned them, no difference whatsoever, but I'll show you those in a second anyway. Just wanted to mention as well, the processor I now use for my 4x5 film is this Stearman Press SP445. Now this is quite expensive for what it is. It's a quite rudimentary plastic tank really, with a couple of holders. You can do 4 sheets at a time. But I will say it's absolutely fantastic at doing what it's supposed to do, and that's churn out high quality negatives. I don't get any stains, I don't get any uneven development, I get no marks around the edges, I get no signs of uneven development or vignetting like I did with some systems. So since getting that has become my go-to development tank for black and white in 4x5. And also it means you can sit it in a water bath, just do normal inversions as if it was a sort of Patterson spiral tank. So highly recommended, and I hope they come out with a decent 10x8 version soon. Right, okay, enough of me. Let's look at the negatives, and then I'll go into Lightroom and show you them side by side and show you how little processing I actually had to do to get the final results for the video. Right, these are my ID11 developed negatives. These are the first shots, so these were all taken at the metered exposure. As you can see that they're quite evenly developed. There's no issues with any stain or any marking around them, as I said earlier. They're also modest contrast. There's not a great deal of contrast. I have fairly dark areas in here, obviously, which are the highlights, and my light areas are the shadows. But nothing which is going to prove a difficult problem for either the scanner or for working in Lightroom later on, which is going to be seen. And also, if I did these in the darkroom, it'd be quite easy to print them. They'd probably print at grade 2 or 3. Now these are the ones taken with ID11, and if I show you the ones taken with the HC110, marks on the sleeve there, very similar, a little bit darker overall, probably a little bit more contrast, but you just do not see that when you scan them, and I don't think I'd notice it particularly in the darkroom either. So rather than dwell on these too much, other than to say I'm very happy with the development. They're very even, very uniform, very smooth, lovely contrast in there. Let's get them scanned and let's have them open in Lightroom. Right, here we are then in my working area in Lightroom. This is the set of images I've imported and the final processed ones you can see here, which made it into the video. Without further ado, let's have a look and compare some of the differences, see if we can spot any differences more like, between the images processed in ID11 and the ones processed in HC110. On the left ID11, on the right HC110. Now, to my eyes, and it may not come through totally clear on the video due to the software, I can actually see little to no difference in the sharpness here. Possibly the ID11 is a little bit sharper. That could just be down to the scan itself and any small anomalies due to the flatness of the film, but no difference in the granularity, no difference in the overall evenness or the contrast. Pretty happy with both of those. Now let's also take a look at the dog tracks, see if we can spot any differences there. ID11 on the left again, and on the right we've got the HC110. Zoom in there. Again, it's pretty much a wash here. I can't see any difference whatsoever. Both about the same in terms of smoothness, contrast, shadow detail, etc. The differences will be in the scan, not in the actual negative. You would not see any difference between these two, I can guarantee it, at any print size. They are, to all intents and purposes, identical. So I could select either of these developers and be quite happy with my results in 4x5 and 8x10, I think. Now let's have a look at the sharpness now of a couple of these images. Let's take the original scan of the second shot and let's compare it to my processed image and just see how much sharpening I applied and how that affects the overall detail level. So on the left we have the original raw scan unsharpened, and on the right we have my processed and sharpened image. Now you can see there is quite a bit more sharpness in there, but it's not detrimental to the image. It's added a little bit of noise and grain, but at this size, and I'll pop up the size of print this would make, it's going to be undetectable, but the sharpness will be detectable. That sharpness is very nice to have. I think also you can see just how impressive the lens performance is here of this Fuji 240A, and also how the sharpness just keeps going on and on and on, right from the front of the image right through to the back, due to the movements of the camera. So that's one of the huge advantages, as I said on the video, of using 4x5 with a planar subject such as this. And finally, I'd just like to do a comparison between a raw scan and one of my processed images, just to show you the manipulations I applied, and they are subtle on this one. They're not very dramatic at all, because I actually like the raw scan as it stands on the left here. It's pretty much what I was after. I don't want to do too much to it, but I have done a few things. First thing is this gully running through here on the left. I've accentuated the shadows by using the a black brush basically, and just gone through there and made it a little bit darker just to set it off against the banks of the mud. Equally, this area here I have lightened to give a greater contrast with that gully. Because it rained, I'd lost some of the nice contrast here on the left, but this area over here was beautifully defined, so I've left it alone. No need to touch it at all. Now the other thing I've done here is to add a subtle vignette. Now I don't like vignettes that are obvious and you can see, so all I've done is to add a vignette in Lightroom, and you can see these edges now are much more even versus these, which are a little bit light, a little bit bright here, and that allows the eye to stray out on the left as well. This one contains you a lot more. Nothing more than that though, very, very subtle. Again, a bit darker here due to the vignette. Brings your eye up into the gully, which is the main subject. And finally, I've added my favourite tone. Now this tone is based on the look of a traditional gelatin silver darkroom paper from Foma, called Fomatone 131, 132 or 532. That just defines the surface type. And it is a warm tone paper, a chlorobromide paper. And I've developed this as if it was in a warm tone developer. Now I've started to use this paper again in the darkroom, because I've started up a darkroom again, and it's a look I absolutely love for this sort of subject. It's subtle, it's warm, it's complementary. I'm not a huge fan of cold black and white. I know a lot of people are. That's just personal preference. Anyway, enough of me. I do hope you've enjoyed the video, the explanation of how and why I took the shots, and a little bit of a look at my scanning and processing technique. And all I've got to say is thank you very much for watching as ever, and I'll see you again on the next trip.